Welcome to this InsurTech webinar, part of the InsurTech Rising Live Digital Week. I'm Oisin Merrins, editor of InsurTech Rising. We will be live tweeting this webinar, so do join the conversation using the hashtag InsurTechLive. So every day this week we are taking on some of the biggest issues facing the insurance industry, bringing you expert discussions through a series of webinars, live Q&As, podcasts and articles, and shedding light on the areas most ripe for innovation. Today's session is titled Risk Redefined, Upending Industry Foundations with AI. I am delighted to be joined by Pádraig Sheeran, VP of Data Science at Prudential, and Stephen Kramer, Catalyst Lead and Director at Swiss Re. I should note from the outset that the views I express this afternoon do not necessarily represent those of Prudential and Swiss Re, respectively. Thanks for joining us both, Pádraig and Stephen. Now, all agree that artificial intelligence has the potential to fundamentally transform the insurance industry, but what form will that transformation take? If, at its core, an insurance company exists to understand and price risk, what effect will the powerful analytical capabilities made possible by AI have? What are the implications of being able to model risk in a more granular fashion? What will the shift from predictive modeling to preventive modeling mean for the insurance business model? And what organizational and cultural changes will the shift from being reactive to being proactive require? So before we discuss these questions with our guests, I'd like to remind you that we'll be holding an interactive Q&A after the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation itself, you can send them to us using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And if you haven't already done so, perhaps maybe start submitting your questions in advance of the discussion. So I'll turn first to Stephen. So Stephen, do you think the statement, as I've put it, describes the effects of AI on insurance? And if not, why not?
I think it describes the effects to some extent. And, you know, obviously it gives us a great potential in terms of using AI to interpret data that we get, dealing with the vast quantities of data that are coming in as the world evolves and uses more and more systems and devices. But what it doesn't describe is how the world is changing outside of the insurance industry and how the insurance industry will have to respond to that. So I think that one of the bigger effects of AI is going to be to change the entire landscape in terms of the way that where risks are, how those risks happen, how they evolve, and how they're managed. If you look at, for example, autonomous vehicles, you know, that completely changes the way in which people traveling around on roads are put at risk. So you know, that's just one example of many places where risks will change. AI is going to give us greater capabilities to understand what's going on in the world. Things like how weather happens, how certain natural events occur. We'll understand those more deeply and perhaps have a greater ability to manage risks rather than have to respond to compensate people after an event has happened. So that there's so many areas out in the world where things are going to change that what's described in that statement is only I suppose a part of the whole bigger picture in terms of AI.
Right, and so kind of building what you said there, how should the many skilled people working in insurance view synthetic intelligence and its impact on their jobs and lives if it's going to have this transformative impact?
I think what we've seen with artificial intelligence is often people are quite resistant to it in industries where it's being introduced because it does impact on the number of jobs. But it does change the way in which people work. And essentially, artificial intelligence is something that augments human capabilities. Over time, it will change the sort of balance in terms of what sorts of jobs exist and how many of those jobs there are. But there's a tremendous opportunity in kind of embracing artificial intelligence and all of what it has to offer. It does mean that the way in which we kind of live our lives, the way in which we have a career is probably going to change because the historical pattern of training at the beginning of your career once and then going through very sort of short bursts of training throughout your career is probably going to shift and people are going to have to engage more with training and understanding how the kind of world around them is changing, and particularly in the sort of startup phase of using artificial intelligence. I think there are a lot of people that aren't prepared for this, and there's going to have to be a process of kind of bringing them in to a system which is, requires different skills than those that they currently have. So it's pretty important in the insurance industry, I think, that we try to take this understanding of the analytical capabilities and what AI is much more broadly across the industry than just in a sort of narrow elite of people working in the IT part.
So, I mean,
but I think essentially they need to embrace it.
Right. So with all of that in mind, where do you think AI will have its biggest impact in the industry?
I think that dealing with the quantities of data that are coming in, it's going to be good for predicting risks much more in a much more sort of granular fashion, and that obviously gives competitive advantage to the companies that do that well. There is the potential, though, that particularly when we're looking at weak signals, that it starts to pick up too much of the noise, and people interpret the noise as a strong signal, and therefore, or the weak signal as a strong signal, and therefore it gives kind of false signals in a way. So we have to be very aware of what we're doing when we're dealing with what AI gives us. It's different to what we've dealt with historically. So I think there are risks related to that, but there are also opportunities. But I think that probably the biggest impact, and it's hard to predict, but the biggest impact probably is going to be our greater ability to manage risk, to be involved in trying to prevent certain loss events from happening, rather than simply predicting them with a certain degree of certainty or uncertainty, and then responding with compensation after the event happens. So I think there will be a shift in terms of the focus of insurance, perhaps from compensating for loss to managing risk. And that takes a huge cultural change. It goes with that, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that kind of leads us nicely, if that is kind of the outlook, the kind of shift towards preventative business model, perhaps for insurance. Porrick, how do you build and organizationally structure a data science team to succeed within an incumbent organization?
Thanks, Oisin, and certainly I would second a lot of Stephen's comments. If you think about an insurance companies were arguably the first companies to use data and crunch numbers. But over time, a lot of that knowledge has been siloed in parts of the insurance company, and typically the actuarial team, some of the risk assessment teams, the finance teams. And when you think about where AI can be used, it's really right across the entire insurance company. And suddenly you need to change culturally to have everybody thinking about data, people knowing how to analyze data, and it's going to become part and parcel of what you do. You also need data-driven leaders across the organization. And in preparation for the future, which is going to be AI, and there's going to be a lot of AI touching every part of the industry, and there's going to be new risks emerging from AI that the insurance industry is going to have to be able to assess and understand. I think today, many insurance companies don't necessarily have very strong data science teams. So I think that's a great point to start. So the question of how do you start to build and structure a data science team for success within an insurance company, it's got to be given some freedom. So typically that is, it sits within a disruption group or within a group that's got less restrictions than existing departments. Then also very closely integrated with your typical actuarial teams, your risk teams, your finance teams. And it's important to start small. I think sometimes what we've seen out there in the industry is people give into the hype, and that may be there's a new tool, and there's probably, hundreds and hundreds of tools that claim to do AI. But before you start to think about tools and think about algorithms, it's important to focus on one or two business problems, partner with your strategy teams, your finance teams to help understand where the most value add is. and really double down on them, because to Stephen's earlier point, there is a lot of skepticism out there about what can be delivered. And it's important to, first of all, focus on one or two problems, deliver them, and show the impact using traditional ROI type metrics that you do for any project. From a talent point of view, it is important to have a few all-rounders, so people that understand the technology, understand algorithms, and can speak the business. But I think we all know that hiring data scientists is difficult. I mean, the insurance industry is competing with every industry to hire them right now. So with that in mind, it's important as you hire a few of these all-rounders that you build, teams of people that are closely connected. And from that point of view, again, it gets back to culture. I think we can adopt a lot of what we've seen from the technology world around having an agile mindset, using Scrum teams, building these cross-discipline teams where you've got your technology people that understand data, you've got data scientists that understand technology, understand the business, you've got your consultant types that can work between the data scientists and the business. It's important to build that cross-discipline team, because the reality is that if you're continuing trying to hire an all-round data scientist, that's going to be very difficult to find. One thing that I also think is very important is at the outset thinking about implementation. A lot of data science projects and a lot of algorithms that are built, they tend to sit on the shelf. They're not necessarily implemented. Some of that is, you got to think of implementation by design at the outset, and really only take on projects where there's a clear path to implementation.
Right, and thanks, Pork. And thinking kind of quite broadly, the insurance industry is generally one of the more regulated industries. So how do you overcome some of the regulatory challenges in the adoption of AI methods to assess risk in the first place?
Yeah, I think this is really one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's certainly one of the huge barriers to adoption. I mean, anyone that's worked in the industry for a long time will have seen new methodologies come and go that might have been a new actuarial approach to assessing risk. It may have been a new data source. What data science and AI does is really starts to exponentially accelerate them problems. We're seeing a new regulation coming in the EU next year. In the US, we did see a movement around disparate impact and what effect using data was going to have on that. So although I think with the new administration, that's seems to be less of a priority right now. But certainly we're seeing right across the world where regulatory bodies are starting to question, are these trends correct? Are they in the consumer's interest? I think Stephen made a good point around, with weak data, without robust analysis, sometimes you can find trends that aren't really trends. So there's going to be, and regulators are really going to put a lot of emphasis on, is this truly a causation between the data and the risk event, or is it a spurious correlation? And I think one place where is a good reference point is the use of credit data in the property and casualty industry, certainly in the US market. Were there, was it AI? Probably not, but it was a lot of regression techniques. It's kind of a simple version of AI, where the question became well, how you pay your bills, how you pay your credit card, how much is on your balance at the end of the month to how much you paid off, is that really correlated to your chances of crashing a car or, your house burning down? And over the last 10, 15 years in that industry, the regulatory bodies, all 50 of them right across every state in the US, have insisted on preparing documents to prove out your analysis to show that you've taken credit data and the effects that you find from credit data, the trends you found are over and above everything else. So you really had to prove out that this is a causation, not just a correlation. There was also a lot of work to make sure you weren't running into redlining issues, or where you weren't picking up an effect that's using variables such as race or religion. So there's a lot of lot of analysis got to be done there. And I think what we're going to start to see is more and more insistence from regulators around how do you prove that out as you are using these algorithms to assess risk? How do you prove that they're truly correlated to risk? And I think we've got to think about that by design. Sometimes the more complicated algorithms are not necessarily the best because they can be difficult to explain. And that's going to be a huge balancing act, and I think it's going to be something the industry is going to have to partner with regulators on to help them come up with the best ways to assess a lot of these new AI techniques as they start to get implemented and used more widespread.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that all would agree there has to be dialogue between regulatory authorities and industry on how to kind of implement and kind of drive the use of AI forward. So turning now to maybe some of the questions that are coming in. Lots of questions coming in, so do keep them coming. One perhaps that I'll put to you first, Stephen. What steps should insurers be taking now to make sure they are AI ready?
There are a couple. I think probably the biggest is to ensure that you prepare the groundwork for AI, which is essentially about understanding existing systems and how they will have to change in order to accommodate AI. So, for example, in a claims department, you might have people working in claims who have a lot of knowledge of what they do and understand very well how to assess a claim, but it's all in their heads. And starting to perhaps collect that data, record that stuff, maybe in an unstructured fashion, turning it into structured, gathering data that allows you to make that transition is probably pretty important. I think also preparing the sort of general workforce, not just the small group involved in AI as a specialty, but preparing the general workforce for AI is important. It's a kind of a mystery for most people what AI is. They don't understand it. They've seen movies about it, and it kind of scares people. And in just talking to people around the insurance industry, I've come across some very strange ideas as to what AI is. And I think we need to develop ways of communicating that essentially AI is just a way of using various techniques around patterns, regressions, etc., to understand data and then try to predict the future. And if people understand it that way and have a sort of deeper knowledge of how it actually works, they would be far more willing to move into a situation where we're using AI, and also more able to come up with good ideas around where the industry should go and new product ideas, etc., than they would if they don't understand the way in which these systems work. So for me, it's essentially mostly about dealing with the workforce and bringing them with us in this, but also preparing, the types of information, the data, etc., that's necessary to make that transition. But I think a point that was made earlier about the issue of regulators, that is hugely important too. And some of the interactions that we've had, there seems to be a lot of resistance to AI, the perception that it's a kind of almost a black box. And things will have to change in the way, perhaps, in which some of the regulations work, in order to perhaps have, maybe where a customer is given advice by a virtual personal assistant, that might have a framework of rules around the advice that keeps it on track, but it might not be quite as auditable as it currently is. That would mean a change in the regulations. So we need to, as insurers, work with the regulators, obviously, to keep them kind of moving forward as well, in order that we can actually use this stuff properly. Otherwise, that will become the kind of gateway that stops us all the time. So there's probably a whole lot that I haven't mentioned, but those are the big ones for me.
Thanks, Stephen. Pork, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think Stephen's covered most of it, so we can jump on to some of the additional questions. I would just repeat a lot of what he said.
So perhaps then maybe you'd like to take this one. How can insurers compete with the Amazons and Googles as well as with the great startups who are out to hire strong AI teams? How do you make the case to the talent?
Yeah, sure. We've faced some of that, certainly with the data science teams that I've built. And the question that we would ask data scientists to join us, why did you choose to join us versus one of the cool and sexy startups that are doing great stuff? And it's often that they see insurance as delivering for society. And sometimes insurance does get a bad rep, but a lot of the time what they like about the insurance industry is the ability to work directly with end customers to disrupt the traditional industry. I guess they look at it and see it as an industry that's ripe for disruption. Certainly they see there's a lot of opportunity there also where, there's a lot of data scientists around the world that are working to keep people on a website 10 seconds longer or to get a few extra clicks on an advertisement where a lot of them tend to like the idea of, well, can I help more people get insured? Can I create new risk assessment products that enable better customer experiences? And they certainly like to see the results of a lot of their work. Whereas, the use of AI and and don't get me wrong, Google, Amazon, they're certainly leaders in the space. I think a lot of the impact they can make there, a lot of them feel that it's more marginal, whereas they can make a huge impact by joining an insurance company. And that's the message that we sell, but that's also what we hear from a lot of the data scientists that have come and work for us.
Thanks, Pork. Stephen, question here. AI is increasingly showing that much of the historical data and internal processes used by insurers are increasingly obsolete. So how do you combat internal resistance to such change within insurers?
That's a tricky one. I think that, obviously the nature of data has changed and also historical data, if we really look into it more deeply, was often recorded in a way which doesn't reflect completely what actually happened. This is an area, I suppose, that mainly those actuaries would be dealing with, looking at historical data, looking at how it sort of moves forward. Actuaries would have been the people in the insurance industry doing that. How do we take them forward? I guess they need to, I suppose, understand the nature of data that's coming through and also understand that AI is able to deal with a lot more data at one time and do statistical analysis and regression on that almost in real time in a way that we haven't been able to in the past. And that gives us probably an ability to respond and to see inflections and to understand shifts and trends much more quickly. So there are those benefits. Perhaps, talking about those benefits, giving people an understanding of those benefits is important. Don't know if I've answered the question really, but.
Thanks, Stephen. Pork, we have a question here that wants a little bit of elaboration. So how do you get from using AI and outcomes derived from AI into changing and driving policyholder or risk behavior? So this needs a serious level of direct contact and interaction. How do you see this being affected in the industry?
I actually think the industry sees this one as a huge opportunity. Because if you think about the insurance industry from a customer's point of view, it's a very low-touch, low interaction. What happens is they get a bill once a year or once every 6 months, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, and that's the only time they hear from the industry after they sell a product. And that's not necessarily a good experience because they get a bill and it's like, well, they pay it or not, and then they decide do they want to shop or not. And if you look at life insurance, often they sell a policy and they might only hear back from the insurance company for 10 years where, hey, do you want to buy another policy? And what happens is that's part of what feeds into maybe some customers not having a great perception of the industry where the only time they interact with them is when they got to pay a bill or when they have to make a claim. And the claim process, the whole process of validating it necessarily makes it not always a great experience. Whereas with AI, you're starting to see, if you're using a telematics device on your phone in the car, which is becoming more and more mainstream, well, that can give you feedback and tell you real time if you change what speed you're doing, you change your braking behavior, you change that, and that's able to translate that into dollar values for you, be that savings in your premium, be that some type of gift cards. Well, that's a good feeling, and people suddenly then start to connect to the insurance company that have bold loyalty. In the life insurance space, we're seeing some companies using Fitbits and health devices to, again, let you give you feedback and say if you get so many steps a day, or if you're eating healthy, not necessarily all collected and recorded accurately today, but giving you point systems for that can then result in cheaper premiums, or again can result in some type of reward system. So it's allowing more positive interactions with insurance companies. And I think that's ultimately a good thing from an end customer's point of view. I do think it's going to change how insurance companies operate, because insurance companies haven't really operated in this sort of a highly transactional nature before, and that requires a change in culture, a change in how we think about it. And I think more and more you're seeing insurance companies creating customer teams, executives that are purely focused on the customer interactions. And that's one of the first steps, I think, towards a huge cultural change, where it's how do they become very customer-centric organizations so that they can see, are these interactions good interactions, and how do you constantly test them over time? And the AI is one thing, but the bigger part is translating that AI into something that makes sense for the customer.
Yeah, I think, can I just add to that it's this idea of managing risk, I think, that instead of compensating for loss, that I think is one of the big shifts with AI. And, this idea of working with the customer it's really important, because if you're managing risk, obviously that has to involve the entity where the risk occurs, and that is the customer. So the customer has to be a partner in managing the risk, and there has to be some sort of dynamic interaction between the two. But doing that successfully, obviously, is quite challenging.
Stephen, so kind of building on that, but this kind of industry pivot from risk transfer to risk advisory, what does that mean for risk pooling? This is a question coming in from somebody listening who wants to know, with enough data, does the current business model break down?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know if I have the full answer to that. I mean, risk pooling has been, we've kind of been moving away from this kind of these big pools of risk for quite some time. Over the last, say, half a century, as we've gathered more data, as we've understood, the more compartmentalized or granular risk better, people have taken the better risks and abandoned the ones that are worse. So risk pooling has been impacted for quite some time, and I imagine that a bit of that will continue. I mean, that is constrained somewhat by regulatory constraints. So, I think it'll be very interesting to see where this goes. Certainly, the idea of pooling people over long periods of time is going to diminish. A lot of insurance is, I think, going to evolve to insurance on demand, able to respond very quickly to a person's need in the moment. So that, to some extent, will change the way in which pooling happens. But, I mean, essentially, that's why insurance companies exist. That is the base of the business model. So, it's not going to disappear. It is our reason for being there. But it might look a little different to what it currently does. Are you there? Hello. It's Stephen here. If anyone can hear me, can you just signal on the question platform? Okay, so people can still hear me. I'm going to deal with one more question that came through from Sophie. It is the question. Okay, we've lost somebody on the line, but apparently you can still hear me. So the question is, what do you think about partnering with startups versus innovating from within your organization? I think that there is some value in partnering with the startups. They come with very, very good ideas. And I think bring fresh concepts into insurance, things that those of us that have been in the industry quite some time don't really see always. But often I think the people working with the startup environment are very difficult to pull into the industry. So it can have its own downsides. There's also innovation, obviously, within the organization that involves bringing all the right people in. Probably what's better is working with organizations, not startups, but others that are involved in the tech space who have been around maybe for a longer time, have more of a kind of base of skills and a record over time, and working with them. So it's probably a combination of all of these to some extent.
Hello, this is Sophie Cater, digital editor of InsurTech Rising. Sorry for the issues with the sound, and Stephen, thank you very much for answering that next question. We are back online, so we're gonna continue for the next few minutes. So sorry to all of those who had a bit of troubles. So Stephen, we've got a question here. How can insurers compete with the Amazons and Googles, as well as great startups, to hire strong AI teams?
I think that one was answered earlier by Patrick.
I see. Okay. So let's move on.
He had a very good answer to that. I don't have such a good one, so.
Oh, no problem. So. I think, I mean, we've discussed pooling data as well, didn't we? And what about partnering with startups? Obviously, at Swiss Re, from your perspective, what's your perspective on that?
Well, we've interacted quite a lot with startups. We've had a very active engagement over the last couple of years. In some ways, it's about encouraging startups, maybe working with them so that they can get going in whatever they're doing, and kind of working hand in hand with them. To some extent, startups maybe try to solve problems within the insurance industry or come with new ideas, and working with and finding those things is obviously important. But it's quite a difficult marriage between, these large companies that exist for quite some time and the kind of startup culture. So I think one has to, find opportunities and connect with them where it's appropriate and where it works. But in many cases, the way in which we evolve will be something more sort of over the longer term, much more considered, working with existing tech companies that have a stronger base. So it's about combining these various elements in the right way.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's great. Thank you so much for your time, Stephen. We're going to round off then. Thanks for joining us, everybody online. So we're really excited to see you at InsurTech Rising, which is from the 16th to the 18th of October. You can get 10% off the event if you use the code InsurTech Rising Live. So just head to our website. There'll be a link up there. There's also a feedback form that you can fill out after that will just pop up onto your screen. So feel free to do that. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.